Well, I've got my notes here, but I may just throw them away. I've been over these points several times, and every time I get off the track and go in a different direction, this is such a very difficult. I've been talking about how full of paradoxes the topic of nature and culture is, culture and morality. It's if you stay within the boundaries of those terms all by themselves, the problem of figuring out human happiness is insoluble. I've been saying already that culture is itself a great paradox because the whole point of culture is to resist nature, but it's part of human nature to create culture. It's natural for us to resist nature and to form groups that create these codes and customs that uh, are somewhat artificial and even seem arbitrary. But here's another paradox. We always seem to do this thinking that we're supporting the cause of morality. We're creating these codes because we're promoting what's good. Of course, in more traditionalist societies, perhaps simpler societies, the claim is often made that the inspiration to do good comes from higher up. It's a divine inspiration. So the gods have given us culture, or God has given us culture. And that's actually not a misleading idea. I would endorse that to this extent. I think it's true that our whatever understanding we have of the good that's genuine comes to us through a kind of inspiration. I think it comes to us from higher up. Call it conscience. Some people think conscience is just another one of these arbitrary, whimsical things that grows out of egotism. I think that conscience, the true conscience, is a higher inspiration. We all have some kind of inkling of what's right and wrong. And of course, unless we're abusive parents, we want our children to share in that knowledge that we have acquired of right and wrong. We don't want to raise our children without, again, in that natural state where they don't have any sort of direction about what's right and wrong. So we steer them in what we think is the proper direction. As good parents, we lay out rules for them. We say, no, you're not going to do this, and you should be doing that. I think an analogy would be mathematics, say your multiplication tables. What do you do with kids who are just starting out in grade school? You teach them by rote, 7 times 7 is 49 and so forth. And they learn the tables without imbibing any kind of deeper principle beyond them at first, but eventually they get to the point where they can multiply numbers that they've never memorized, but there's a principle behind all of this that they have imbibed, and so now they don't need to learn by rote. They can take off on their own. This is surely what we want the good person to achieve when we teach our children certain do's and don'ts. We know that they're not developed enough yet to understand right and wrong on their own, but we want them to graduate to a level where they can make those determinations for themselves. That's culture at its best. Um, I think every culture tries to do that. But then, see, here's the paradox that we, in creating these codes of do's and don'ts and trying to impart knowledge of good and evil to the next generation, we're also at the same time somewhat working against this idea of accessing something from within. We're kind of sending the message that no, knowledge of right and wrong is comes from the outside. It's in the sacred text, or it's in our law code. It's you just do this because your ancestors said to do it, and they were smarter than you did, or they got that knowledge from on high, and then we're fouling up the waters again. We're not encouraging our young to get to know goodness personally. And so culture, even at the same time that it tries to impart knowledge of goodness, can undermine the the access to that knowledge that the young are supposed to be striving for. And also, because there is a kind of arbitrary element to the do's and don'ts that a given culture chooses to emphasize, sometimes we can transmit to the next generation that they should be doing something or shouldn't be doing something which actually is not morally justified. And so then things get really fouled up. You have cultures that, for instance, teach that you should never marry anyone but a person of the opposite sex, and you should only take one mate. And that's my position, honestly. And I could defend that rationally. I think I could say that the respect that we owe to other human beings would gravitate against one person having several mates. I also think that marriage should be dedicated to childbearing instead of to having good sex. And so if there's not a possibility of childbearing, there's really no reason to get married. You can just be good friends with a person. Or if you just want to have good sex, well, then your life is being controlled by an impulse. And whenever life is being controlled by impulses, whether it's anger or sex or fear or whatever, it's not a good thing. It's not a thing that a rational person strives for. You see, I just it's an example of a kind of thumbnail case for a certain cultural position. That's what my culture has traditionally thought, but I don't endorse that just because it comes from my culture. I've also thought it out, and I think I can rationally defend it. However, there are other cultures that endorse polygamy. And increasingly, there are subcultures in our own culture that believe that marriage between people of the same sex is perfectly okay. And there are those who believe increasingly, apparently, that you could have a marriage that lasts for a year, and then the two parties can split and find other mates and so on. And so this is kind of where I left off in the previous video. What do you do when you have cultures that clash in this fashion? Because it's wrong for one culture forcibly to change another culture. The use of power there, of force to make people adjust their moral views, which your culture sees as being violated by this other culture, is not really itself moral. You're treating these other people like little kids, and you're forcing them to obey in the confidence that farther up the line they're going to see, oh yeah, they were really right. I'm glad they invaded us because now we see the light. That's the other thing that's wrong with that, is that a culture is not an individual. This knowledge that we have of goodness and that we transmit to our children is actually a knowledge that works through individual hearts and minds. And yes, it can be supported by our cultural environment, but always its true operation is from individual to individual. You can have people in a good culture, in a morally higher culture, who are lousy people because as individuals they haven't really personally imbibed the moral principles that the culture is designed to transmit. And they can move in on another culture which appears to, it can be polygamous and practicing human sacrifice and all the things that we might generally agree are not so healthy morally. But there could be individuals in that culture who are actually better persons. And yet here's the superior culture who's clamping down on them and insisting that they change. This is not the way it's supposed to work. It's not going to be a happy outcome. So, I mean, internationally, I think during the Cold War, we in the United States did a pretty good job, much better than the Soviet Union and the Chinese. Chinese are still doing this. They are moving in on other cultures and trying to rearrange their beliefs. Although I don't think the Chinese could give a damn about culture. They just want power. And after all, they're exterminating the Muslim culture of the Uyghurs in northwestern China, but they're making this tight alliance with the Iranian Shia, and those are marriages of convenience. It's not that the Chinese care about Islam one way or another. They just want people to collaborate in their program for world domination. And so for the Soviet Union in the good old days too. And we in the United States kind of play that game, but not so much really in the years when I was growing up. We've been trying to do that more in the last 20 years. We've been trying to overhaul Islam and make it more like the kind of culture that we approve of. And the irony is a lot of Muslims who've taken refuge in our country, I think really don't want to live under Sharia law. And yet increasingly their communities in this country are becoming Sharia communities. And so they're between a rock and a hard place. They have to become more like the kind of Muslim that they didn't want to be, or then they turn to broader American culture for a little bit of release. But the broader culture is saying, oh no, we're keeping our hands off because it's wrong to judge another culture. If this is what Islamic culture wants to do, then it's okay with us. So the people who are more moderate are kind of caught in the middle because mainstream culture will not, it's no longer really a culture. It's not taking a stand. We in the United States today are so worried about this second imperative that I mentioned, how a culture must never by force engineer a change in an inferior culture, that we go to the opposite extreme and we by default allow minority cultures to proliferate and to prosper while our own traditional values are kind of erased or allowed to fade into the background. We don't want to be assertive. It would be too brutal. So it's just a strictly hands-off policy. So here, not in the international sphere so much as in the national sphere, we find that culture is creating a fatal problem for us, and our politics cannot resolve this. This is the essence of why our politics fails us. Multiculturalism is killing us. It's killing us because as the more enlightened, tolerant mainstream culture, again, we're keeping our hands off of these proliferating minority cultures that are sort of subcultures within our group because we don't want to be bullies. And what this, in fact, creates is a situation where mainstream culture disappears. So, for instance, somebody who wants to teach his kids that heterosexual marriage between two people is the right way to go, dare not say to his kids when they come home and say, well, what about Bob and Jim who live next door? They're a couple. Is that wrong? Well, yes and no. I mean, we don't judge them. That's their way of doing things. But I'm not a relativist because I want you to know that this is the right way. But I don't want you to be judgmental either. So I'm not a relativist, but I'm not going to say that what they're doing is wrong. Well, that's game, set, and match. I mean, you've just completely surrendered the cultural message that you wanted to transmit. You have no culture left. As an agency, an exponent of mainstream culture, you no longer exist. And your children, heaven help them. I mean, even an adult can see that this is nonsense, but a child trying to make some sense out of that message will walk away utterly confused. And this is where we are politically. And this is why our attempt to use culture to transmit morality has and failed and is failing and must fail as long as we do not have borders. I'm going to return to the subject of borders in the next video, but in the borderless globe, the world without borders that we all seem to be trying to create, we're really talking about a world without culture, where different cultural groups cannot raise their children and tend to their different ways as seems best to them, and enjoy a hands-off attitude from surrounding cultures. We can't do that anymore because we're all mixing it up together. And that's not going to work because ultimately, as I said at the outset, a world without culture is impossible. Even a small group of human beings on an island without culture is impossible. Wherever you get a group of human beings together, you're going to have a culture emerging. So what we have is a free-for-all, and the dominant culture, which is probably going to be a minority culture, because that's the one that has the most energy and the most fight, while the mainstream culture is just leaning back supine and presenting its throat. The minority culture, or cultures that prevail in this dogfight, are not going to give us a very happy world where we really want our children to grow up. This is not an optimistic scenario.